Renata Cole had been a postal supervisor for 19 years, and in all that time she had never once handed a customer a package and actively hoped, that they'd just give it back. "It's not really yours," she said, setting the small water-stained box on the counter between them. "Legally, I mean, it's addressed to someone else. We found it in the old Route 9 annex during the teardown, sat behind a wall panel for 30 years. Near as the postmark can tell, the address on it doesn't exist anymore. Streets got renumbered back in the 80s, whole grid shifted. Closest match we could find was your house." Eli Marsh turned the box over in his hands. It was soft at the corners, the cardboard gone the color of weak tea, taped with a kind of packing tape that hadn't been sold in decades. The address was typed in a font nobody used anymore, the ribbon gone faint in places. "Mrs. Margaret Hale, 142 Birchwood Lane." "Never heard of her," Eli said. "We're at 142 Birchwood. Have been since I bought the place 9 years ago. Whole street's been there longer than that, though. Older houses. Like I said, streets got renumbered. Your house used to be 118, according to the old plat maps. I checked because I was curious, too." Renata pushed a clipboard across the counter, more out of habit than expectation. "Officially, I'm supposed to mark it undeliverable and send it back to processing, where it'll sit in a bin until somebody decides whether a 30-year-old address with a number that doesn't exist is worth chasing. Realistically, nobody will. It'll get logged, shelved, and in about 6 months it'll end up in a landfill with a few thousand other things just like it." She paused, and for a moment something in her face shifted. Not quite guilt, but close. "Unofficially, I'm handing it to you, because it showed up at your address, even with the numbers off, and what you do with it is between you and whoever finds it, weighs heavier than the rulebook." Eli's daughter, Sadie, 9 years old, missing a front tooth, perpetually covered in marker from wrist to elbow, leaned over the counter to get a look at the box, standing on her toes. "What's inside?" "That," Renata said, "is exactly the question I'd have too. And also exactly the question I'm not allowed to ask, because officially I never saw what's inside it. I just saw a box that needed a home, and your house was the closest thing to one it had left." She slid it the rest of the way across the counter. "Good luck, Mr. Marsh. And for what it's worth, whatever it is, it's been waiting a long time." At the kitchen table that night, Eli cut through 30 years of packing tape with a butter knife while Sadie hovered at his shoulder, practically vibrating, her homework forgotten and pushed to the far end of the table. Inside, wrapped in a layer of plastic that had somehow held against 3 decades of damp annex air, were 2 things. A thick stack of paper certificates, each one stamped with a bank seal Eli didn't recognize, the kind of seal that belonged to a bank that probably didn't exist under that name anymore, and a single envelope, unopened, with one word written across the front in careful, old-fashioned cursive. "Maggie." "Savings bonds," Eli said slowly, fanning through the certificates one by one. The paper was thick, official, the kind of document people used to keep in safe deposit boxes, old ones. These things matured decades ago, if the bank's still tracking the account, or whatever entity took it over. He did some quick math in his head, frowned, and did it again, because the first number seemed too large to be right. "Sadie, these might be worth more now than when somebody bought them. A lot more. Like, a lot more. What's in the envelope?" Eli turned it over carefully. It wasn't sealed with glue. It had been sealed with wax, the old-fashioned way, an initial pressed into the wax with a stamp. "R.H." "I don't think that's mine to open," he said, setting it down on the table like it might bruise. "But it's been 30 years, Sadie said, leaning in. "What if whoever it's for isn't? What if they're not around anymore? What if nobody's ever around to read it?" "Then it's even more not mine to open," Eli said. "Somebody wrote this for somebody named Maggie, and sealed it with their own initial, and put it in the mail 30 years ago, thinking it'd get there in a few days. Whatever's in those bonds, whatever's in that letter, that's not a windfall, kiddo. That's somebody's whole life, sitting in a wall for 30 years because the mail lost track of it." He looked at his daughter, who was staring at the envelope with the particular intensity she usually reserved for unsolved word problems. "We're going to find Maggie." "How?" "I don't know yet," Eli admitted. "But we've got a name, an old address, a bank seal, and an initial. That's more than nothing." Sadie sat up straighter. "Like a detective." "Like a detective," Eli agreed. "But the kind that gives things back at the end. It took 6 weeks, and it became, in Sadie's words, the best school project that wasn't actually for school. The trail started at the bank that had issued the bonds, long since merged into a larger one, the old name surviving only as a line of text in internal records. After several emails, 2 dead ends, and 1 patient call with a records clerk, who clearly didn't get many questions about 30-year-old paper bonds, the bank confirmed the certificates had been purchased jointly, in the names of Robert Hale and Margaret Hale, with a mailing address matching the original package, 118 Birchwood Lane, before the renumbering. From there, Sadie took over, in the sense that she commandeered the local library's microfilm machine on 3 consecutive Saturdays and refused to leave until closing. She found a wedding announcement first, faded and small, tucked into the back pages of an old weekly paper. Robert Hale of Cutter's Mill to Margaret Doyle in a small ceremony at St. Andrews. A few pages and a few years later, in a different roll of microfilm, she found an obituary. Robert Hale, age 58, survived by his wife, Margaret of Birchwood Lane. Sadie read it twice before she said anything. He died before the package even got lost, she said quietly. Dad, look at the date. He died before the postmark on the box. Eli leaned in and checked the date against the smudged postmark they'd photographed. Weeks earlier. Looks like he died about 6 months after he mailed it. So he never knew it didn't arrive, Sadie said. He thought she had it. This whole time, he thought she had it. And she's been without it, Eli said, slowly, for 30 years. If she's even still. He stopped himself before he finished the thought, because Sadie was already scrolling to the next reel, jaw set in the way that meant she had no intention of stopping now. It took another week, full of dead ends, wrong Margarets, and 1 confusing call with a Margaret Hale who turned out to be 26 and lived 3 states away. Before they found her, Margaret Hale, age 86, a long-term resident of Cutter's Mill Senior Living, 20 minutes outside town. Eli called ahead, spoke carefully and slowly to the front desk and explained as much as he reasonably could over the phone without it sounding. He was aware, completely unbelievable. He was told that Mrs. Hale didn't get many visitors these days, but that she was, on good days, sharp as anything, and would likely be delighted by visitors of any kind, for almost any reason at all. Margaret Hale was a small woman in a cardigan the color of faded roses, sitting by a window that looked out over a courtyard full of bird feeders, and when Eli set the box on the table in front of her, she looked at it, the way people look at something from a dream they'd stopped having long ago. That's Robert's handwriting, she said, before Eli had said a single word about what was inside. Her hand, thin and spotted with age, hovered just above the envelope without quite touching it. The way you might hover your hand over a candle flame to feel the heat without committing to it. I haven't seen that handwriting in 30 years. Not since the funeral cards. It came to my house, Eli said gently, sitting down across from her, Sadie standing close at his shoulder, very still, the way she got when she sensed something important was happening and didn't want to be the one to break it. Old address, yours, before the streets got renumbered. It got stuck behind a wall in a sorting building for 30 years. Nobody opened it. I didn't open the letter. Figured that part, at least, wasn't mine to do. Margaret looked up at him, and then at Sadie, and something in her face softened even further. Will you both stay while I read it? She asked. I don't think I want to be alone for this. Not after 30 years of being alone for everything else about him. She opened the envelope with hands that shook only a little, more from age than nerves, and unfolded a page that had somehow stayed dry inside its wax seal. She read it in silence for a long moment, long enough that Eli wondered whether he should step out and give her privacy. And then Margaret laughed, a small, wet, startled sound, and pressed the letter flat against her chest like she was trying to keep it from floating away. He bought these, she said, nodding at the stack of bonds without looking away from the letter. The month before he passed. I remember, he told me he had a surprise for our anniversary. Something for someday, he said. I always wondered what he meant by that. I thought maybe he meant a trip we never got to take. Or maybe he meant nothing at all. Sometimes people say things like that, and it's just talk. The way men sometimes talk, especially near the end, when they want to leave you something hopeful. She wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, carefully, like she didn't want to smudge anything. He wrote that he wanted me to have something that would still be growing, long after he was gone. Said not to be afraid to spend it on something that mattered, when the right time came. Said he was sorry he couldn't be there to see what that turned out to be. She looked down at the stack of certificates, yellowed, decades old, worth, by Eli's careful estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 now. 30 years, Margaret said softly, almost to herself. He's been trying to finish that sentence to me for 30 years, and I never even knew he'd started it. 6 months later, Renata Cole found herself, for the first time in 19 years on the job, delivering a package she had personally been looking forward to delivering all morning. It was small, much smaller than the one that had started all of this, and it was addressed to Sadie Marsh, care of her father. Sender listed simply as M. Hale, Cutter's Mill Senior Living. Inside was a card, and folded inside the card was a check made out to a 529 education savings account that Margaret had opened that spring, with a note written in the same careful, old-fashioned hand that Robert Hale had once used to write a single word on an envelope. Sadie, your father did something rare. He found me when he didn't have to, and he let an old woman finish a conversation with her husband, 30 years late. I'd like to help finish something for you too. Whatever someday looks like, when you get there, spend it on something that matters. That's what he'd have wanted. Margaret. Sadie had been visiting Margaret nearly every weekend since that first afternoon at Cutter's Mill, bringing drawings, reading aloud from library books a chapter at a time, once arriving with an entire shoebox of marker drawings, because Grandma Margaret likes colors, and the day-room walls are boring. Margaret, without anyone quite deciding it on purpose, had started calling Sadie my girl, and Sadie had started, just as naturally, calling her Grandma Margaret, a title that had simply appeared one Saturday and never left. Renata stood on the porch a little longer than the delivery strictly required, watching through the screen door as Sadie read the card aloud, her voice climbing with every sentence, and Eli, the same man Renata had handed an undeliverable box to 6 months ago, half expecting him to shrug, cash the bonds, and let post office's mistake quietly disappear, stood very still in the hallway, the way people do when something lands harder than they were braced for. You did the right thing, you know, Renata said, when Eli finally came to the door. Most people would have just cashed those bonds and called it luck. Lost mail, finders keepers, nobody would have blamed you. I wouldn't have. Didn't feel like luck, Eli said. Felt like somebody's whole life, sitting on a doorstep 30 years late. Wasn't going to leave it there a day longer than it had to be. Renata looked past him, into the hallway, where Sadie was already asking, for the third time that week, when they could go visit Grandma Margaret again, and at a small framed photo on the wall that Renata hadn't noticed on her last delivery. Sadie and an elderly woman in a rose-colored cardigan, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. A photo that looked like it had been taken on an ordinary Tuesday, and had become, somehow, one of the most important things in the house. For what it's worth, Renata said, I almost just wrote that box off, filed it, shelved it, let it sit until somebody decided it wasn't worth the paperwork, which is most things, eventually. Somebody would have known the difference, though, Eli said. She waited 30 years for that letter without even knowing she was waiting. If it had just sat in a bin somewhere, she'd have died without ever knowing he tried. Renata nodded slowly, and didn't say anything else. But, on the drive back to the post office, she found herself thinking about all the things that sat in bins and back rooms, waiting for someone to decide they were worth a second look. Maybe, from now on, she'd be slower to write things off. Behind her on the porch, Sadie was already starting a new drawing, a house, a small post office with a flag out front, and a figure in a rose-colored cardigan standing between two smaller figures, and across the top, in careful, determined 9-year-old capital letters, the kind of letters that take a while to get right and mean it anyway, she wrote one word. Family.